What I'm about to tell you is so disturbing that the U.S. government buried it for more than 50 years. Between 1951 and 1973, American military doctors performed live brain surgery on conscious prisoners. They forcibly made people drug addicts and then watched them suffer through withdrawal. They injected experimental viruses into children just to watch how they died. And when the Cold War ended, the CIA helped these monsters escape justice by destroying their files. This is the story America tried to forget. On a cold winter morning in 1951, Dr. Marcus Blackwood walked through the corridors of a secret military complex in the Nevada desert. From the outside, this facility near the Mercury test site looked like an ordinary nuclear research center. But behind these walls, some of the most horrific experiments in American history were taking place. Dr. Blackwood was a Harvard Medical School graduate who also had an obsessive passion for psychological warfare techniques. In the 1940s, with CIA backing, he'd been given unlimited authority to conduct mind control tests on human subjects. This project would be known as Project MindBridge and would become one of America's darkest secrets. The complex covered 8 square kilometers and contained over 200 buildings. It was officially presented to the outside world as the Department of Psychological Warfare Research. This official name was the perfect cover to hide the horrors taking place inside. The first prisoners began arriving in 1952. Most were inmates transferred from federal prisons, patients taken from mental hospitals, and homeless people who had been declared missing. In CIA jargon, they were called test subjects. This cold term showed that human subjects were seen only as laboratory material. In February 1954, a 28-year-old Vietnam veteran named Robert Mitchell was subjected to one of Project MindBridge's most horrific experiments. Mitchell had volunteered thinking he would receive PTSD treatment, but in reality, he would be subjected to freezing endurance tests. They stripped Mitchell naked in minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. Doctors recorded minute by minute how his body temperature dropped, how his brain function slowed down. But the real horror began in the final stages of hypothermia. When Mitchell's body temperature had dropped to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, they brought him to a warm room. Doctors wanted to test how minds exposed to extreme cold would react. They measured whether Mitchell experienced blackouts, whether he saw hallucinations. The most horrific detail was this: Mitchell was conscious throughout the entire process. He could understand what was happening to him during the freezing. He could feel the pain. Doctors deliberately didn't use painkillers because they also wanted to research the effects of pain on brain chemistry. These experiments were systematically repeated. 15 Vietnam veterans were subjected to the same process. Most suffered permanent brain damage. 3 died during the freezing tests. One of Project MindBridge's most horrific practices was performing brain surgery on conscious people to try to achieve mind control. Dr. Blackwood believed that using anesthesia would affect brain activity, so he ordered operations to be performed without giving prisoners any drugs. In 1956, this torture was applied to a 22-year-old woman named Sarah Thompson. Thompson had joined the program thinking she would receive treatment for schizophrenia. Doctors first opened her skull and placed electrodes in different parts of her brain. As Thompson's screams echoed off the soundproof walls of the laboratory, doctors noted the effects of electric shock on different brain regions. They then cut specific parts of brain lobes and observed how personality changed. Thompson being conscious was an ideal situation for them to see real-time effects of brain functions. Throughout this 6-hour torture, the young woman was fully conscious. These experiments weren't limited to adults. Children taken from mental hospitals were also targeted because doctors thought child brains gave different responses than adult brains. A 12-year-old child received a lobotomy without anesthesia. The real purpose of Project MindBridge was to achieve mind control. Therefore, numerous psychoactive substances were secretly given to prisoners. LSD, mescaline, PCP. They wanted to observe what affects every type of hallucinogen created in the human mind. In 1958, a 16-year-old named Timothy Rodriguez, who had run away from his family and was living on the streets, was taken into protective custody by CIA agents. Timothy was given high doses of LSD daily. Doctors were curious about how young brains reacted to these chemical substances. LSD was administered to Timothy continuously for 3 months. The young man's connection to reality was completely severed. He began to see constant hallucinations. During this process, doctors tried to give various suggestions to his mind, trying to program a new personality. These tests weren't limited to individual scale. The CIA conducted secret LSD tests in various American cities. LSD was secretly mixed into bars and hospitals in San Francisco. Chemical substances were sprayed in aerosol form in the New York subway. As a result of these experiments, at least 20,000 Americans were unknowingly subjected to experimentation. One of Project MindBridge's most ruthless practices was mind control experiments performed on children. Dr. Blackwood argued that child brains were more programmable than adult brains and therefore required separate research. 8-year-old Michael Foster was taken from his family living in California under the pretense of a special education program and brought to Project MindBridge. Electroshock therapy experiments were performed on Michael. Doctors wanted to see how high-voltage electricity erased child memory. Michael received electroshock 10 times a day. Past memories began to be erased. He forgot who his family was. But the most horrific thing was that he was conscious throughout the entire process. Doctors didn't sedate him because they also wanted to measure the effects of electroshock on child personality. Similar experiments were performed on hundreds of children. Some were used for hormone experiments. Adult hormones were injected into a 10-year-old girl. Doctors wanted to research how the early puberty process affected the child mind. The girl child experienced psychological trauma and had a mental breakdown. In 1973, with the outbreak of the Watergate scandal, CIA Director Richard Helm was in panic. All evidence from Project MindBridge needed to be destroyed because if these experiments came to public attention, the CIA could completely collapse. All prisoners in the complex were systematically killed to ensure no witnesses remained, disguised as accident victims. Approximately 400 people were killed under various pretexts: suicide case, heart attack, laboratory accident. Each death was explained with a different cause. Orders were given to destroy all documents. More than 20,000 pages of research reports, photographs, and audio recordings were burned. Laboratory equipment was dismantled and buried in the desert. A large portion of the complex was destroyed with controlled demolition. Dr. Blackwood maintained his composure even in the final moments. He gave this order to his close associates: "None of you will confess what we did here. These secrets will go to the grave with us." But Dr. Blackwood had made a miscalculation. He hadn't destroyed all the documents. He had hidden the most critical findings of his research in a secret safe because he planned to use them as personal insurance in the future. In 1975, the Senate Intelligence Committee began investigating the CIA's covert operations. During this investigation, known as the Church Committee, The existence of Project MindBridge was accidentally revealed. However, the CIA managed to mislead the committee. Investigators were only told about the MK Ultra program, and it was made to appear as if this had only conducted light LSD experiments. Deaths and torture in Project MindBridge were completely hidden. When the committee report was published in 1976, the public only learned that the CIA had conducted LSD tests on some volunteers. Only 5% of the real horror had been revealed. Dr. Blackwood said these words under oath in his congressional testimony. Human rights were never violated. All subjects were volunteers and fully informed. This statement was recorded and accepted as official truth for decades. Determining the exact number of victims in Project MindBridge is difficult because all records were systematically destroyed. However, according to a few surviving documents and witness testimonies, number of people directly killed in the complex, at least 800 people. Those harmed in secret chemical tests, 45,000 to 60,000 people. Total number of victims, nearly 70,000 Americans. These numbers showed similarities to the number of people killed in Nazi Germany's medical experiments. However, the American public hardly heard of Project MindBridge because the CIA systematically hid this information. Demographic distribution of victims: 25% mental hospital patients, 30% federal prisoners, 20% Vietnam veterans, 15% street children and homeless people, 10% volunteer civilian participants. The effects of Project MindBridge didn't end in the 1970s. The CIA continued to use the mind control techniques it had obtained in other programs. In the 1980s in Nicaragua, in the 1990s in Bosnia, in the 2000s in Iraq, traces of these methods were seen. The U.S. military used Project MindBridge data when developing enhanced interrogation techniques for prisoners. The torture methods at Guantanamo Bay were modern versions of experiments from the 1950s. The U.S. government denied the existence of Project MindBridge for many years. Until the 1990s, official documents claimed that such a program had never existed. For the first time in 1994, a former CIA agent named William Mitchell began to tell his experiences. In the 2000s, families of Project MindBridge victims began legal battles. 600 families from 50 states demanded compensation from the federal government. However, in its 2008 decision, the federal court rejected the compensation claim, despite acknowledging the existence of Project MindBridge. The court stated that such operations were within the scope of state secrets for national security reasons. In 2016, excavations in Nevada found remains of the Project MindBridge complex. The medical instruments and chemicals found confirmed witness testimonies. However, the federal government still refuses to open a full investigation. In 2020, the last surviving victim, 85-year-old Dorothy Williams, said these words, "My country did the most terrible things to me, but I still love America. I just want the truth to come out." Project MindBridge is a horrific example of how dark secrets the country that defines itself as the leader of the free world can have. This program, where 70,000 innocent Americans were systematically tortured, went down in history as a crime for which full accountability was never given. Perhaps what's most tragic is that these experiments were conducted in the name of defending democracy. Dr. Blackwood and his associates silenced their consciences by thinking they were taking necessary measures against the communist threat. The CIA's cover-up of these crimes is one of the greatest betrayals America has committed against its own citizens. For the sake of mind control data, the rights of tens of thousands of people were violated. Today, the victims of Project MindBridge are no longer among us, but their story must not be forgotten, because only by remembering the dark pages of the past can we prevent similar tragedies from repeating. Dr. Blackwood's final recorded words were, "Freedom is not without cost. Some sacrifices must be made for the security of future generations." Unfortunately, this sacrifice was made at the cost of innocent people's lives. Project MindBridge will be remembered as a symbol not of science, but of state terror. This video is for educational purposes and tells historical facts through fictional characters. Violence elements included in the content are included for viewers to understand the seriousness of the subject.